my vision. You can stay seated. Be thou my vision, O Lord of my heart. Not be all else to me, save that thou art. Thou my best thought, by day or by night. Waking or sleeping, thy presence my light. Be thou my wisdom, and thou my true word. I ever with thee, and thou with me, Lord. Thou my great Father, I thy true Son. Thou in me dwelling, and I with thee one. Riches I heed not, or man's empty praise. Thou mine inheritance, now and always. Thou and thou only, first in my heart. I, King of heaven, my treasure thou art. I, King of heaven, my victory won. May I reach heaven's joys, O bright heaven's sun. Heart of my own heart, whatever befall, still be my vision, O ruler of all. Welcome, Joseph.
Well, testing 1, 2, 3. That sounds like we're on, which is wonderful. It's always a pleasure to be back at this church, and we're going to be doing a couple of things tonight. We're going to start with a fun program about dinosaurs. That's what my PhD research is mostly focused in, and it's one of the biggest questions we have in the world of creation research, dinosaurs. And I know that you've been hosting creation research for some 30-odd years, but it's always good to, I'm sure you've heard of dinosaur presentations over that time, but I thought it's always good to go back and visit that topic and look and see what new discoveries have been made over the last few years. We're also going to, later on in the second presentation, have a look at a program which we call the Science of Creation. How can we understand creation in light of science? What does creation have to do with science? And how can we study things and study the world in light of God's creation? So those are our two programs that we're going to deal with tonight. Just a little reminder and a bit of an update as to what we've been doing over the last 9 months or so since I was last here. A reminder of our website, creationresearchusa.org, as well as our main website, creationresearch.net. And we have a whole bunch of resources which is available online, including our live broadcast channel, which goes out online 24/7. Some of you may be familiar with David Reeves Ministries here in Tennessee. We work very closely with them over in Dixon. Well, he had a 24/7 live channel as well, which has just been taken down off of YouTube. They didn't like him very much, it turns out. So he's been fully cancelled and fully removed. So do pray for David and for his ministry. We're one of the, in fact, I believe I'm right in saying we are now the only 24/7 live stream of creation material anywhere in the world. So do pray for us as well that they don't take us down. We've been doing our museums project, pretty busy in the UK. Since I was over here last, that's opened up fully. So continue to pray for that. We have over 40,000 fossils and artifacts in our collection, which includes things like natural history, geology, and archaeology. We get to take people round. We get to show people the evidence that's on display. Things like living fossils after their kind. Well, we've got a bunch of living fossils here today from our USA Museum collection, so I'd encourage you to come down and have a look at those as well. And we make the point regarding after their kind living fossils, because that was a term coined by Charles Darwin. He said that these creatures that hadn't appeared to have evolved, that they were the same both in the fossil record as well as today, he said that they ought to be anomalies, one-offs, the unusual thing. Well, we make the point that they are extremely abundant all the way throughout the fossil record, no matter how old you want to make the rocks. And, well, after their kind is a biblical concept. 10 times in Genesis chapter 1, it says that God created all living things to reproduce after their kind, and that's the point of living fossils, including the ones that we have here today. Excuse me. So we had a great open day this year, our first main open day for the museum where it was fully open. We have a bunch of fantastic volunteers which volunteered to dress up as dinosaurs, and that's an axolotl, by the way, the big pink thing in the middle there. We have a real-life axolotl at the museum. He's become sort of a little mascot. He's very, very popular with all of the visitors, and so they went out in town and encouraged people to come along and see the dinosaurs in the museum, as well as all of course, the dinosaur fossils. You can find out more at creationresearchcentre.com. You can support the global museum ministry, because it is global. We have our own museum ministry over here in the USA as well, and you will see a sign-up sheet down there. I'd encourage you to sign up to our newsletters, not just because it'll keep you up to date with what we've been doing over the last little while, but also because we have launched a new magazine, the Creation Research magazine. Some of you may have heard of or know about the Answers magazine produced by Answers in Genesis. Well, it turns out that they're actually completely cancelling that and finishing the whole project after the next one. There will be no more Answers magazine. Well, we didn't know about that when we started this. We wanted a research-based magazine, and so we've been able to produce that successfully. We've got a few copies down here. Help yourself. The first one is free, and it will turn to a subscription base at some point in the future. But do help yourself and find out more things, including a feature article about evidence for Noah's flood here in Tennessee. So that's available, and that's a brand new resource for you as well. Continue to pray for the ministry around the world. I was saying just earlier, I now feel like a missionary in my own country. It's becoming increasingly secular. It's becoming increasingly pagan. And so the work of creation research, as well as the work of the museums project, is really, really vital. You can just see some of our team here. Professor Andy McIntosh, well-known creation scientist in the world of creation, a very good friend of myself personally and of the ministry in the UK. He helps us as sort of on our board to help look after the scientific side of things at the museum. You can see Steve there in the middle. Steve is our sort of retired missionary. He worked in missions for many, many years. Come on board with us here in the UK in order to be able to take the museum project forward and look after that. He's great at engaging with people with the gospel. That's what this is all about. And you can also see over there on the far right-hand side, Craig Hawkins. Craig is a scientist who's been working with creation research for a number of years, and he's come on board to sort of take on the responsibilities of our dear brother John Mackay, who ran the ministry for many, many years and has sort of had to take a little bit of a step back into semi-retirement. He's never going to fully retire, but he's sort of director emeritus, we call him now. And so Craig has come on board to help run the Australian ministry, and Craig's been able to not only help take over the Australian ministry. You can see he's been to the UK and he's been to the USA just a number of weeks ago. We took him up to Mount St. Helens. We were up there with the Goke family, who are also here tonight, also a member of the Creation Research team now. So if you haven't met them, go and speak to them. They're here now tonight. We went up to the famous Mount St. Helens, got to work with the Creation Centre there, got to travel all the way around, got to speak in a number of churches. So do pray for Craig. It was the first time I'd spoken side by side with Craig, even though I've been working with him for many, many years. It was only the second time I'd met him in person. So do pray for Craig as he continues this vital work of the ministry in Australia. I then flew home after coming to the States back in September, ended up meeting up with Craig, doing some stuff in the UK, and then went to Morocco. Why did we go to Morocco? Because it's a fantastic place for fossils. It's one of the best places in the world for fossils. We went out to the old Sahara Desert, just the edge there, went down into the mines and ended up digging up a whole bunch of fossils. We're actually planning on going back there in the future with David Reeves from the USA to go and film a documentary. Fabulous fossils, fabulous evidence for the flood as well. And do pray for Mohan. Who's Mohan? Well, he was our fossil guide, a geologist by training, geologist by background, and he was a nominal Muslim. I say nominal Muslim because we spoke to him and we said, "Are you a Muslim?" And he kind of went, "Sort of." And I said, "Well, what do you mean? Why are you a Muslim?" And he said, "Well, I'm a Muslim because I was born a Muslim." I mean, that's the way that you often become a Muslim if you live in the Muslim world. And it was interesting because he was particularly dissatisfied with the Islamic religion. Well, that's a great opportunity for us. And so we managed to have a number of very good conversations with him about the gospel. Bearing in mind, it's a 3-year prison sentence in Morocco if you try and convert somebody from the Islamic religion. I didn't tell my wife that until after I got back home. But we had some very interesting conversations with Mohan, and he even allowed us to hold a small church service in his back garden. There was a group of 4 of us Christians that were traveling there. We had a little communion service, and he actually asked if he could join us. Well, I'd prepared a short sermon there, but I decided to scrap that sermon on the spot and open up our Bibles to John chapter 10. I and the Father are one, because it's a big clash in the Islamic religion of how on earth could Jesus really be God. So do pray for Mohan. We had some very interesting conversations. He really does seem to be at least open, if not searching, and we've got a great contact with him there. We'll be going back to visit him. So do pray for more opportunities, not just for the research and the fossils, but also so that the gospel can go forward. All right, our main topic tonight, dinosaurs, for the next 30 minutes or so. A Bible verse, Philippians chapter 2, verse 5. I've used this with you guys before, I'm sure you remember. Let this mind be in you that was also in Christ. Of course, in the context of Philippians, Paul is talking to the church in Philippi saying, let your conduct, let your brotherly love be like Christ. Let it be Christ-like. But it's a really good statement to apply elsewhere as well, including into the world of dinosaurs. You see, dinosaurs, people have lots of questions about them. It's a stumbling block for many people. Many people think that, well, you have to believe in evolution if you want to believe in dinosaurs. How can, therefore, that idea, that concept of dinosaurs fit into the Bible? Well, if we're going to get to the bottom of these big questions, we need to be thinking about the world the way that Jesus Christ thinks about the world. So what do the scriptures reveal to us about the history of the world? Well, it starts in the beginning with God created. You can read about it in Genesis chapter 1. God made each after its own kind. God made man in his image, and God created the world very good. Genesis chapter 1, verse 31. And of course, you and I view the word good as a moral word, and it is, but it's a lot more than that, because God actually described what his very good creation was like. He said in Genesis chapter 1, verse 29 and 30, all creatures were vegetarian. They were only given permission to eat plants, no meat whatsoever. Now, of course, this has been a little bit different to the world that we live in today. And of course, you find out by the time you get to Genesis chapter 3, man has now sinned, God curses the ground, death has entered the world, and the world has gone from good to bad. And then by the time you get down to Noah's flood, the Bible says that the thoughts and the intents of mankind's heart was only evil continually, and so God judged the world with a global flood. The world had changed from good to bad to worse. Well, there's the foundations. Let's turn to the dinosaurs. A few weeks ago, literally only 4 or 5 weeks ago, we were up at the Hells Creek Formation in Glendive, Montana, and we were digging up dinosaur bones. I say we, that was me, that was Craig Hawkins, who you met earlier, it was the Goke family who are here tonight, and it was our colleagues over from Arkansas, Glenn and Ruby Wilson. I believe they've visited here last year. So you have plenty of dinosaurs in the USA, but then you guys know that. But we have a fair few dinosaur locations in the UK as well. Here you can see John Mackay underneath a big cliff. I took him here a number of years ago, way back in 2016, I think it was, because we were going there to dig up dinosaurs. You see the big red layer? You see the sort of grey layer at the top? Well, that grey layer up the top is known as Jurassic rocks. Jurassic rocks are named after the rocks in the Jura Mountains. Nothing to do with millions of years of evolution, everything to do with where they were first studied. And you can find dinosaur bones there. You might just be able to spot the dinosaur bone here. There's the arrow pointing to it. It's kind of coming down and curving around. It's part of a rib. In fact, you can actually see on the table down here some of those dinosaur bones that were excavated from the Hells Creek Formation just a few weeks ago. Come and speak to the people who even excavated them. But there's plenty of stuff to be found in the UK, including these big chunks of dinosaur bone just lying there loose on the beach. In fact, if you go to the Isle of Wight, a small island off the coast, the south coast of the United Kingdom, it's the dinosaur capital of Europe. It is the 6th best place in the world for diversity of dinosaur bones, and not very many people, even on the Isle of Wight, know that. But you can find some pretty amazing stuff, such as this dinosaur skull that we excavated a few years ago. Of course, one of the downsides of being on a small island off the coast of another small island is that you're kind of governed by tides. You don't have to worry about that in places like the Grand Canyon or up in the Hells Creek Formation. But in the United Kingdom, more often than not, the place that you're digging fossils up, you're governed by tides. And of course, if the tide comes in, you don't want it to cut you off and you drown. So it does mean that you do end up on the beach at 3 o'clock in the morning trying to excavate the dinosaur skull that you found earlier. So if you come on field trips, well, you don't actually have to do that if you don't want to, but many of the field trips that we lead all over the world, including a couple in the next few days, speak to Cheryl if you want to find out more about the field trips we've been doing, but you can find some really good fossils with us, including things like dinosaur bones. So dinosaurs are found all over the world for sure, and dinosaur bones are found there, and dinosaur bones are what prove to us that these creatures once existed. We really do go out and we really do dig up these bones of these great big creatures. In fact, the man who invented the name dinosaur, Sir Richard Owen, from the Natural History Museum, he founded the Natural History Museum in London, the big famous one, he said that dinosaurs were, quote unquote, the monsters God made. And he didn't mean a monster as in sort of like, big scary monster. He just meant great big creature. In fact, he even called dinosaurs, which means terrible lizard. And again, not terrible as in really bad, but terrible as in really big. These were the really big creatures that God made. So we know that they exist, but as you dig up these dinosaur bones, there are a few questions to be asked. How do dinosaur fossils form? What evidence do they show? Do they show evidence of millions of years and slow burial? Or do they show evidence of a quick flood burial? That's what we're going to investigate now. Excuse me. I have some terrible allergies that have popped up for some reason. And the question we're going to deal with is, who is your authority? Is it God's unchanging word, or is it man's continually evolving theories? Which one does the evidence best fit? Well, let's start with this. How did these dinosaurs get into the rocks? One children's book, easily accessible in the UK. How an animal can become a fossil. Step 1, the animal dies and sinks to the bottom of the sea and it's covered by sediment. Step 2, the body dissolves, leaving a mold. The mold fills up with sediment and minerals and it becomes a cast, and then eventually through erosion you end up with a dinosaur fossil. Now there's an awful lot wrong with this Bear in mind, this is a children's book, and I know you have to simplify things for children's books, but outright lies don't tend to go down too well. I mean, for starters, the fossils that we find are the actual bones. We're not dealing with a cast, we're not dealing with a copy, we're dealing with the actual dinosaur bones. The process is called permineralization, literally permeated with minerals. But the actual dinosaur bone is still there. It's not become a cast. But there's another question. A question which isn't raised here, but is presented here. You see, the question that you have to ask is, step one, an animal dies and sinks to the bottom of the sea. Okay, question. What is a 2-story tall, 40-ton dinosaur doing out at the sea in the first place in order to be able to be buried? Because this is a land dinosaur. This is a big land dinosaur. What's he doing out in the middle of the sea waiting to die in order to get buried? Because they actually have it right. The evidence does seem to suggest that most of these creatures got buried in water, in marine sediments. But how did it get there? Well, and it's not a small animal, these are big creatures. So the only real explanation that you've got is that some kind of a flood actually swept them out to sea. And of course, these are big creatures, so therefore it must have been a pretty big flood. Well, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Here's a slightly more technical diagram from a museum in the UK about a dinosaur dying and becoming a fossil. Step one, the dinosaur collapses and dies. Poor Mr. Dinosaur. Flesh rots away and the bones remain. The water level rises and it buries those bones. And then eventually, you see the big long arrow of time? You see, the story that they tell you in books, in media, in museums, is that fossilization, that's turning a creature into a fossil, preserving it in rock, not necessarily turning it to stone, but preserving it in stone, is a very slow process. And then, of course, the Bible says, test all things, hold fast to what is good, in 1 Thessalonians 5:21. So let's do some testing. Let's go to the fossils of the USA. Let's go to the National Dinosaur Monument where you can see Camarasaurus. And his head is thrown up in the air and his tail is up in the air as well. And his legs are sort of splayed out underneath. Now, I hope you realize when you go to a museum and you see your dinosaur skeleton in your museum and it's doing a nice pose like this, that's not how we dug the thing up. In fact, most dinosaur bones we find are very fragmentary. But whenever we do find complete or partially complete dinosaur bones, dinosaur skeletons, this is what they look like, with their head thrown back and their tail in the air. There's from the same place, Allosaurus. In fact, you can go up to Canada, into the southern Alberta Badlands. I was up in the southern Alberta, in the Badlands of northern Montana. They kind of spread from Montana up into Canada. We were there just a few weeks ago, as I said, digging up these dinosaur bones. Amazing stuff to be found. We got to go and visit the Glendive Dinosaur Museum and see just the sheer volume of fossils that you get out of the Hells Creek Formation. And the Hells Creek Formation and the Badlands have got some very interesting complete dinosaurs as well. Here's one. Notice the same position, head in the air, tail in the air. There's another one. There's Gorosaurus. Look at the position of that neck. We really are dealing with a strange phenomena here, with the head thrown back, the mouth open, the tail in the air, and the legs squashed up underneath. So what is going on with all of the dinosaurs in the Badlands of the USA and of Canada? Well, it's not just the dinosaurs of the USA and of Canada. You can come to the UK. You come down to the south coast, to the famous Jurassic coast, and you can see Scelidosaurus. There's the artist's impression. There's the fossil one. Oh, that's a picture of the fossil one because, you see, they wouldn't allow you to take pictures of the real fossil, so we had to go and find the owner and get his permission to take the photos. But just look at the complete skeleton there. You see the head thrown up, the tail in the air, the legs squashed. It's the same overall position, but this fossil has got another feature, a really strange and slightly disgusting feature. Because you see, here's the owner pointing out the real fossil, and he's pointing out something quite remarkable. Because by the time you get there and you look at the throat, it's actually still got food there in his throat. And you can tell whether the food is on its way down or on its way back up by how digested it is. And indeed, you can trace this food all the way down this creature's throat, and there is food still in its stomach. This is a dinosaur that is vomiting. It's been caught up and it's been squashed so suddenly and so violently, it's forced that food back up its throat. Now, that's a revolting thing to think about on a Sunday evening, but it makes a really important point. You see, this is a dinosaur that was killed and buried violently. This wasn't a dinosaur that was dying and just lying around for a while. This is a dinosaur that got buried alive. This is a dinosaur with food in its stomach, vomit in its throat. It's been squashed and it's buried with seashells. That very fact alone tells you that this creature drowned. And it drowned in a flood because whenever you find land creatures and seashells and plants all buried together in one deposit, you've got very good evidence of a flood. Creatures and animals that do not belong together in the real world being buried together in the same sediment is very good evidence of a flood. And indeed, you can trace the flood deposits all the way up the United Kingdom. You can see the evidence of flooding in the rocks in the UK. It's the same story in that famous Isle of Wight bed. Here's the most complete iguanodon dinosaur fossil that's ever been found from the Isle of Wight. In fact, ever been found in the United Kingdom. Now, the local museum where this is on display has very helpfully put this big sort of grid pattern of windows in front of it, so you can't really see it all that clearly, but just to help you out, there's the head up there, there's the neck, follow the curvature of the neck, and have a look at the diagram of how it was found. Hey, it's the same thing. There's the head bent backwards, the tail splayed, and the legs sort of splayed out as well. So what's going on with these dinosaurs? Because it's the same in the USA, it's the same in the UK. Well, in one of your big science conferences, specifically about fossils and dinosaurs, a very interesting report was published. And this report got reported on itself by a magazine called New Scientist. New Scientist is sort of a science magazine that takes very technical journal articles and puts it into sort of layman's terms, terms that like the likes of I and you can sort of understand. Well, this is what they had to say. Many dinosaurs are found with their head and their neck bent backwards and their tail arched over their back. Immersion in water is the simplest explanation. In other words, the easiest and simplest explanation for why these dinosaurs are found like this all over the planet is because they drowned. In fact, here's a brand new fossil find from the Isle of Wight. I was involved in some of the reporting on this, found at a place called Shanklin, and they said it was very unusual. And it is. I've been to Shanklin many times. I've never found dinosaur bones there. And they said it's very unusual. And why was it unusual? Because it was found mixed with fossil oyster shells. In fact, there's the report that the museum had out. Let's zoom in on it a little bit. Zoom into that section. Look at what it has to say. There was this creature that was found. It's very strange to have found it there. But look at what they said. It's likely that our dinosaur was living on land just a few miles away to the north where it was what? Caught up in a flood. In fact, there's the picture on display in the museum of a dinosaur drowning in the flood. Oh no, this isn't a creationist museum. This is a secular museum. But even they can't deny the overwhelming evidence that these creatures drowned. There's the dinosaur in the dead dinosaur pose, and look at what he's about to be buried next to. Bunch of seashells. Well, it's not just the UK, and it's not just the USA. It's Germany. Tail in the air, head bent backwards, mouth open, legs squashed up underneath. It's Italy. Head thrown back, mouth open, tail in the air, legs squashed up underneath. It's in Nigeria and Africa. Look at the curvature on that spine. Wow. I mean, they haven't even excavated the skull yet, but it's the same thing. It's Canada, and it's all over the world. And remember the point? Immersion in water is the simplest explanation. The evidence is that all of these dinosaurs did indeed drown. Let's go one step further. Daspletosaurus in a museum in Canada. There's the sign. Daspletosaurus was a large carnivore with powerful jaws. It was collected, and it's got this classic death pose with the neck pulled back over its body, the tail arched forwards, and the hind limbs tightly flexed. This pose is common amongst the park's meat-eating dinosaurs, and it's an indication of what? A central nervous system trauma at the time of death related to drowning. One drawing, one picture, one painting of drowning dinosaurs. But no, again, this is not a picture that I've got one of our artists to draw of dinosaurs drowning in Noah's flood. It's actually on display at Dinosaur Provincial Park. By no means any friend of the Bible, by no means any friend of creation, and yet even they can't deny the overwhelming evidence that these creatures drowned in a flood. In fact, sometimes it pays to take a step back and look at the big picture. I've been mentored by John Mackay, who's visited this church many times, and you'll know of his stories and accounts of traveling all over the world. I've barely done a fraction of that, but I've had the privilege of traveling in many different places around the world, and I've seen the evidence for myself. These are creatures that are found drowned all over the world. In fact, they're not just drowned, by the way. They're drowned and they've been buried real quick. How do we know? Well, research has now shown that these dinosaurs had to be buried within 3 minutes, otherwise they would revert back to a natural pose. How do we know that? Well, you remember that description of a central nervous system trauma? The reality is all living creatures do this. Whenever you're about to drown, the very last thing that your body does is it sends a shockwave down your spine to make you go, "Gah!" Now, I don't have a tail or a long neck, so my body doesn't quite look like a dinosaur's, but it's the same reaction. And in any creatures that have a long neck, their neck bends backwards. In any creatures that have a long tail, their tail arches upwards. In any creatures that have legs, they squish up. And you look like a drowned dinosaur. The problem is that if you've drowned in water, of course, you are now dead. You've got no control over your body, and you're suspended in water. And so very quickly your head will flop forward, your tail will flop down, and no longer will you look like a drowned dinosaur. In fact, if you want to actually be preserved in that position, you have to be buried in sediment to stop you from going into any other position within 3 minutes. These are creatures that have been drowned. These are dinosaurs which have been buried in water very rapidly. They've been found all over the world. It's starting to sound an awful lot like a global flood. But note very well, it's not the evidence that contradicts the Word of God, it's the opinions of mankind. In fact, if you want a fossil, it's got nothing to do with time, but everything to do with a process. Let me share with you briefly about some of the recent research that I've been doing into the world of dinosaurs, particularly to do with dinosaur cells and fibers, soft, squidgy stuff inside dinosaur bones that really shouldn't be there if these things are millions of years old. Now, a point for prayer, we are submitting, once I get back to the UK in about a week and a half's time, we are submitting a paper to the journal Nature, a very prestigious journal, all about our most recent research. In fact, if you want to find out about our most recent research, we have a report from the University of Liverpool, authored by myself and a few others. If you want the technical side of things, I'd encourage you to pick one of those up. But for this sort of introduction, we're going to deal with another paper, a paper that was published a few years back in 2015. It just gives us a bit of an oversight as to what's been actually found. Published in the Nature Communications, which is part of the Nature family of publications. There's the title, Fibers and Cellular Structures Preserved in 75 Million-Year-Old Dinosaur Specimens. What did they do? Well, they used a technique called scanning electron microscopy in order to study dinosaur bones from Dinosaur Park Formation in Alberta in Canada. These bones were collected in the early 20th century, so 100 years ago or so, and they were held in the Natural History Museum in London in the UK. There's some examples from the paper of what they used, a theropod claw and some ribs. So what did they find? Well, in the theropod claw, they found erythrocyte-like structures. We all know what erythrocytes are, yeah? Well, they're red blood cells. Scientists like using big technical words to confuse people, but erythrocytes are simply red blood cells. In the hadrosaur leg and foot bones, they found fibrous structures full of carbon. In the ceratopsid bone, they found more of those erythrocyte-like structures, the red blood cells, and in the rib from the unknown species, they found collagen-like fibers. Collagen is a very fibrous protein that's found in bones. You'll probably know collagen. You get it in skin creams and hair. You make your hair grow and your skin glow and all that. Well, collagen is actually a protein. It's a soft, squidgy material, much like skin and meat and muscle things are proteins. And it's found in bones as well as skin and hair. It helps to hold your bones together. It's a very fibrous protein. Well, what about these dinosaur names? Well, the theropods are these bipedal dinosaurs with the small clawed front limbs. Think T-Rex, right? That's perhaps the most famous dinosaur of all, and certainly the most famous theropod. The hadrosaurs were the duck-billed dinosaurs. The ceratopsids were the horned dinosaurs. Cera, horn, top on your head. So these are the horned dinosaurs, like, of course, Triceratops. Well, they said there was a problem. in this paper, a problem about preservation. They said it's long been accepted that protein molecules decay in relatively short periods of time and cannot be preserved for longer than 4 million years. Now, I would actually contest that number. In fact, so would the biggest critic of this research. And sometimes the biggest critic of me is my best friend, because you see, a man called Michael Buckley from the University of Manchester, his quote is, "There is less than 1% chance of less than 1% protein, collagen protein, existing in less than 1 million years." In other words, he's using the lessons to kind of cover his back. But by the time you get to 1 million years, according to his research, you should have no collagen left in the bones whatsoever. The problem is that I'm finding collagen in bones that are supposed to be up to 200 million years old. And his response is that cannot simply be possible, because protein could not last more than 1 million years. His problem is that I turn around and say, I'm very happy with that, because I don't believe they're millions of years old. But if you were, just for the sake of the argument for now, let's go with the 4 million years mark. The point they're making is that protein can't last for longer than 4 million years, given our understanding of science. Therefore, they say, even in cases where organic material is preserved, it's generally accepted that only parts of original proteins are preserved and that the full tertiary or quaternary structure has been lost. In other words, if we do find any organic materials anything older than this, then they should just be really decayed, really broken down, hardly identifiable. But the problem is, we observed, they said, structures resembling calcified collagen fibers from modern bone, structures enriched in carbon, and structures that resemble erythrocytes or red blood cells from birds. Now, don't worry too much about the ins and outs of the scientific techniques here. Just look at some of the pictures, because what we're going to do, we're going to compare the two. We're going to compare what they found with modern-day examples. These were all published in that paper. On the top, you can see fibers that they found inside the dinosaur rib. In the bottom, you can see collagen fibers from a modern animal. Now, the top is definitely more decayed. But then you would expect that, because collagen, even though it's a tough protein, it still decays pretty quickly. Even after just a few years, it begins to decay. But they do match. You can see this knobbly-bobbly looking stuff. This is under a special technique with a scanning electron microscope, and the different colors are different depths of field underneath the microscope. And again, you can match stuff from animals to these erythrocyte-like structures, these red blood-like structures inside the theropod claw. More examples from the dinosaur rib, this fibery organic stuff. In fact, there's the stuff from the dinosaur rib on the on the left-hand side there, and stuff from the modern bone on the right-hand side. Again, you can match, and this is not a one-off publication. There are now over 150 publications, not in creationist journals, but in secular, peer-reviewed, refereed scientific journals that report on original biomaterial, that's soft tissue to the likes of you and me, inside these bones. Well, what's the big point? Well, a good guy to comment on it is Professor Ed Neeland. Professor Ed Neeland is an organic chemist. He makes molecules for a living. He knows how fragile they are. He knows how complex they are. And he had this to say about the discovery of these biomolecules inside these dinosaur bones. He said, red blood cells, intact proteins, and flexible tissues in these bones have a known shelf life. In other words, we know how long it takes for them to break down and decay. We've done experiments to try and slow down their decay. We know how fragile they are. He said, experimental evidence indicates shelf lifetimes running from months to perhaps thousands of years for certain proteins. So when a scientist claims to have found time-sensitive, in other words, short shelf-life chemicals inside an 80-million-year-old sample, this defies all of our experimental data. Something is wrong. He says it would be like finding a bottle of milk from 1951 and it being completely fresh. Impossible, in other words. He said, we know experimentally that blood and proteins are not structurally maintained over a long time. They degrade. That is a reproducible, testable, observable fact. The dating of bones, however, is more suspect and is based on some questionable assumptions. He concludes by saying the biblical creation model says that the universe and the earth are only thousands of years old. And that is in line with what is found inside dinosaur bone fossils. This is a clear-cut example where the evidence contradicts the evolution model's prediction and it supports the creation model's prediction. Let's come on to my research. One Jurassic crocodilian vertebrae. Why crocodilian? Because dinosaurs are cool, let's face it. People love dinosaurs. That's what gets published, right? Why did I choose a crocodilian? Well, I've done enough dinosaurs. We've tested over 8 different dinosaur bones for collagen. We've found collagen in all of them. Why did we choose crocodilian? Well, one of the big criticisms of this research is you cannot know whether the fossil material you're finding, the collagen that you're finding inside these fossils, is endogenous. What's endogenous? It means it originally belongs to the bone. In other words, the claim is they believe that what we're finding is contamination. How do we not know that I didn't accidentally spit in it or drop some skin in it? Or, how do we know that it wasn't a bacteria that was producing this collagen-like stuff? Well, the reason I tried to do a crocodilian bone is because even according to evolution, crocodilians have experienced what they call evolutionary stasis for over 200 million years. In other words, according to evolution, crocodiles haven't changed in 200 million years. Now, again, I don't believe that they're that old. I also think that that's a great piece of evidence that creatures don't evolve, because even according to evolution, crocodiles haven't evolved. But we can now do something which has never been done before. We can test an exact like-for-like example of a fossil. Believe it or not, that has never been done before in the world of science. Well, what do? Well, we took some nice, cool photos of the bone to start with. You can see all the internal structure. In fact, this is a great example to show you what a dinosaur bone, or indeed a crocodile bone, looks like when it becomes a fossil. Because what you can see here is that the bone has not turned to stone. That's a misnomer about a lot of fossils. What has happened here is a process called permineralization. You can see the red arrow there pointing to the yellow patch in the middle. They are minerals that have infilled the bone, but the black bone is still there. Even the bone itself, it's very porous. It's been infilled with minerals. Even the bone itself is very tiny microscopic holes that have been infilled, but the actual bone is still there. You can perhaps see it more clearly on the right-hand side. We've got all those little grains of minerals that have penetrated the bone. But the bone, that black stuff, is still there. So what do? Well, first of all, we take a very thin slice of the bone, call it a thin section, and we put it under a technique called cross-polarized light microscopy. What does that do? Well, it gives us some pretty pictures. Can you see all the red stuff? Can you see all the blue stuff? Well, X-pol light is interesting because it is a medical technique which is used to identify collagen inside modern bone samples. And it was a technique that was developed most recently by a scientist from the Institute of Creation Research, a colleague of mine. He did the same PhD that I'm doing at Liverpool University. And he said, I wonder if we can use this technique to look at modern collagen, will it work with fossil collagen? And they tested it, and indeed they found inside this crocodilian bone, all the blue fluorescent patches is all evidence of collagen. So there's definitely collagen within this bone sample, but how do we know that it's endogenous? In fact, how do we even know that it's definitely collagen? Well, now we can do a technique called mass spectrometry. In mass spectrometry, we take that sample, we demineralize it, get rid of all the minerals, and we put it through a special machine, and it gives us a bunch of squiggly lines. And again, we won't go into the deep science, but what we're basically doing is we're looking to match the squiggly lines up with modern-day examples of collagen. So we use something like a bovine collagen or a modern-day alligator to compare it to. And what we found is that, yes, this bone is full of collagen. Now we can go one step further. We can do a technique called proteomics. Now, we're not quite reading the DNA here, but we're getting awfully close. What we're doing is we're actually sequencing, we're identifying which specific proteins, which peptides are there inside the collagen protein. Now, what did we discover? Well, what we found is that this Jurassic crocodilian bone has got biology in it that matches perfectly with the American alligator, with the Chinese alligator, and with the saltwater crocodile. In other words, number one, crocodiles haven't evolved. Even their biology is still the same. Number two, we have very good evidence that the collagen we're finding inside of this bone is endogenous. It does indeed belong to the bone. Why? Because we are finding crocodilian biology inside crocodilian bones. If it was a mistake, if I'd spat in it or dropped skin in it by accident, and by the way, we are very, very meticulous about how we prepare these samples in a sterile environment, in sterilized instruments, making sure we take it only from deep inside the bone. But even if it was contamination, it should have come up with human. Or at very least, it should be mammalian. I'd have been happy if it was just simply reptilian. But no, we were actually able to identify 3 different peptides, 3 different parts of that protein, which matches with 3 different modern-day crocodilians, which tells you that not only is it endogenous, as Ed Nealon put it, it's a real big blow to the theory of evolution that these things really are indeed millions of years old. By the way, you can find out a whole bunch about this project. You can pick up the research paper if you like all the sciencey stuff, or we've got a documentary. I don't think it's here tonight, but it's available to purchase online and to watch online, called The Dinosaur Project. You can see about it at the dinosaur-project.com, where we've interviewed a bunch of scientists dealing with this, and I've been privileged enough over the last few years to be involved in this research, and I would ask that you pray for the future publications that will be coming out about this as well. You see, as we wrap up, the big thing that we all need to make sure we're doing, and the challenge that I make to everybody who is involved in this kind of research, in this kind of interest or understanding, is to take off Charles Darwin's glasses and to start seeing things God's way. By the way, that's the statue of Charles Darwin outside the school which he was taught at, less than 20 minutes away from our Creation Museum. We didn't plan that. It turns out God has a sense of humor. But you see, the challenge is everybody views the world through lenses. Are you going to view the world the way that Darwin viewed the world, which, let's face it, is a pretty bleak view of the world? Or are you going to start seeing things God's way, which says that even though the world is now bad, that's not how it started off. Things started off very good. Man messed up, man sinned, God cursed the ground, and the world went from good to bad to worse. And in my opinion, one of the bad things that happened was the extinction of the dinosaurs. I think it'd be cool to have some dinosaurs around, but let's dig up their fossils, let's believe that they were real creatures, but let's use the evidence, whether it's from their bones or indeed from their biology, let's use it to declare God's goodness and glory until he returns again. Let this mind be in you that is also in Christ. Let's start thinking about the world the way that Jesus Christ thinks about the world, and we'll do pretty well. Just to finish, we have a Telegram channel for me personally. I'm on Facebook now. You can follow me as a public figure on Facebook. If you want to know where we're going, what we're doing, and where our travels are taking us, do pick up the Creation Research magazine available over there. And we've got our fossil finding field trip coming up on Friday, this Friday as well. Speak to Cheryl and Dennis if you want to find out more. Well, we're going to have a brief pause. We've got about 5 minutes or so for some questions, and then we'll have a little bit of a break, a chance to see some of the fossils and resources before we come back for our second presentation. So does anybody have any questions about what we've spoken about tonight so far, or the wider topic in general? No, sorry. We'll we'll go over this. Yeah, sorry.
What is the scientific community, or so-called scientific community?
Yeah.
How are they responding to your research?
One of 3 ways. Either they say, this is impossible, what you're finding. Therefore, because you can't find this stuff in stuff that's millions of years old, it wouldn't last for millions of years. So this is impossible what you're finding, therefore it must be contamination. Now that's easier now to combat than it was 5 years ago. Number one, between 1993 and 2019, the number of publications was about 85. So in other words, in roughly 30 years, about 85 publications on soft tissue have been published. That's still a pretty high amount. But between 2019 and 2025, some 6 years, that publication has risen to over 150. So there is a marked increase in the number of discoveries, right? So this isn't just one person finding the odd thing here and there in a particular bone from a particular location. This is now a widespread piece of research. So it's easy to refute, but that's one of the arguments. It's just contamination because it's impossible. The second one is, oh, well, soft tissue must just last for millions of years. Now, that goes against everything we know about in biology, and that's, let's face it, usually the response that we get from the paleontologists, because paleontologists deal mostly with dead things. Most paleontologists are not fully aware of how the living things function. And so they make claims like, well, soft tissue can just last for millions of years, even though everything we see in biology would tell you otherwise. The third response that we get, which is becoming rarer, but it was very common in the beginning, is I just simply don't care. Right? In fact, it was Mary Schweitzer, who is a professing Christian but not a creationist. When she first found the soft tissue, she went to her leading professor and said, look at what I found. And he looked at it and he said, that's impossible. I'm not even interested in entertaining the idea. Right? And that's about as unscientific as you can get. She actually asked him, what evidence would you be willing to accept that this stuff was real? And his response was, nothing whatsoever. Now, it turns out that he, 30 years down the line, is now one of the biggest workers and supporters of this soft tissue research. He's now switched and believes that soft tissue can last for millions of years, right? That's his belief now. But we still are seeing a lot of pushback. Because at the end of the day, you've only got one of three options, right? Either it is contamination, which we can have a very good argument against now. Either soft tissue can last for millions of years, which we've always had a very good argument against because of observational science. Or the third option is that the dinosaur bones are not millions of years old. Well, that's the only option that is unavailable, really, to an evolutionist's mind. So they are prepared to believe what is scientifically impossible in order to continue to hold on to their belief in millions of years. So those are the three main responses that we get, and there are good arguments against each one of them. So really, I believe this is one of the most powerful pieces of research in modern creationist research, or indeed modern scientific research for the creationist position. Yeah, basically, more or less, yeah. I mean, I've seen shouting matches across scientific establishment. In fact, I'll share this one with you. Earlier this year, I was presenting this paper. So this paper, this report, is a poster form that we published at a scientific conference. It was the American Society of Mass Spectrometry, so mostly chemists and stuff like that. But we were presenting this fossil research that went into this paper. And I actually had one guy come up to me, because I was there under the name of my university, University of Liverpool, which is, of course, a secular university. And I had one guy come up to me, really interested. He was talking through all of that. He said, this is fantastic stuff you got. He said, just be careful no creationists get hold of the data, because they'd have a field day with it. So there we go. Yes?
I had a question about how they come up with the age of the Earth and different things through ice ages and digging core samples of ice and going down ever how far, and then determining how old the Earth is based on what they find in ice. What is the reality of that, or scientific evidence of any ice ages and so forth?
Yeah, so we could talk an awful long time about how they come up with these ages and stuff, but the ice cores you've hit on is a really good example of the underlying assumption that goes into the calculations that produce the age of the Earth. So the reality is scientists believe that the Earth was millions of years old long before the first ice core was dug, long before the first radiometric dating method was invented, in fact, long before we knew that rocks were radioactive. People believed in millions of years. And the reason why is it comes down to an underlying assumption which was promoted, really invented by a man called James Hutton, who was a Scotsman in the 1700s. It was heavily promoted by a man called Charles Lyell, who was the mentor of Charles Darwin. And the underlying philosophy is uniformitarianism. In other words, the present is the key to the past. Whatever is happening today has always been happening. Therefore, we calculate backwards and come up with an age of the Earth. Now, they do that with dating methods like radiometric dating methods. It's very easy to refute it because we have so many examples of rocks with a known age, in other words, a witnessed age, that have been dated to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. There was one example that I usually carry around with me from Capella in Hawaii. Hawaii, where it was observed to have erupted in 1801. Two different dating methods. Potassium to argon gives it a date of over 1 billion years. Helium dating gives it a date of at least 600 million years, and yet it was observed to have erupted only a couple of hundred years ago, right? When it comes to ice cores, what they do is they dig down through the ice layers, take a big ice core, and they look at the ice layers. And the assumption is you produce one layer per winter. Well, that's a okay assumption. The problem with that, number one, much like with the rock example that I just used from Capellahu, we have found modern day, well, I say modern day, World War I, or World War II rather, aircraft buried underneath many, many, many layers of ice, right? Way beyond the 50 or so that they should have been where at the time they were discovered, right? So that tells you that maybe it's not just one layer a year. But the underlying philosophy still comes in, because if you want to assume that it's one layer per winter, therefore one layer per year, then you just begin to count the layers down. And what you find is after about 3,500 layers, all of a sudden the layers have become so compacted together that you cannot see the layers anymore, even under a microscope. So what do? Well, you simply take the average thickness of a layer from the previous 2,500, 3,000 odd layers, and you continue to use that average measurement, and you assume that you can count it up all the way down, even though you can't see the layers. You just calculate down, and there's your age of the ice glacier, some 100 to 150,000 years. Now, there's your underlying assumption there. It's the same underlying assumption that is found in every single dating method. It's the same underlying assumption that is in the problem, the so-called distant starlight problem, radiometric dating, how you get things like chalk and limestone, and so on and so forth. It's an underlying philosophy called uniformitarianism, and it was designed by Charles Lyell, quote unquote, to free science from Moses. In other words, his entire philosophy was to get God out of people's thinking, so don't be surprised that if you use that philosophy in science, it leaves you with no other option than to reject the scriptures. But you have to recognize it is a philosophy, and it is applied throughout the sciences. Yeah, I believe that. It's not explicitly stated in Scripture, but what we are told in Scripture is that in the beginning everything was very good. Right? Now, you can go out to an ice cap and take all your clothes off, and very good is probably not the first thing that springs to mind, right? God describes the climate as being very good as well. Now, where is your first mechanism? Even though the world falls, Genesis chapter 3, there is still no mechanism to change the climate on a global scale until Noah's flood. Because at the end of Genesis chapter 8 verse 21, God gives a promise: as long as the earth shall remain, there will be seed time, harvest, cold, heat, summer and winter. First ever reference to climate change in the Bible. So I think, yes, both the biblical and the scientific evidence tells us that before the flood it was a pretty much tropical to subtropical world, no ice caps. That came about because of the major climate change that happened after the flood. Well, I have one last question.
Joseph, you've seen me for years here,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not struggling with this as a born-again believer, but I haven't heard you mention it, and I don't know if John did years ago, and I just forgot. I don't need any validation that it's true or not, but I was just curious. Looking at the animals, the fossils found all across these continents, could Pangea be, not that it was necessary, to support the flood coming in, but just, is that even valid?
Okay, yeah. So Pangea, for those who don't know, this is the idea that at one point in Earth's history, the world only had one landmass, and that it split apart at some point. Now, from a secular evolutionary perspective, it was one landmass that split apart very, very slowly over millions of years. That is based off of what we were just talking about, uniformitarianism. We see movement amongst the Earth's crust today. Some of them appear to be moving apart. Some of them don't appear to be doing much other than little wiggles around. But the assumption is, well, if it's moving very slowly today, then if you calculate backwards over the 4.5 billion years of Earth's supposed history, then you could have had one landmass at the past. And indeed, from geology, many of the land masses do look like they fit together. Well, let's just leave that to one side and see what the scriptures say. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Easy start. Day 3 of creation, God said, let the waters be gathered together into one place and let the dry land appear. In other words, the implication purely from the scriptures is that there was one mass of water and one mass of land. Let the waters be gathered together into one place and let the dry land appear. One water mass, one dry land mass. That's what the scriptures give us an indication of on day 3 of creation, Genesis chapter 1. In other words, there's no problem. In fact, it would even indicate in the Bible that there was originally one land mass and one water mass, which is what we see in science. The idea that, South America fits up into Africa quite nicely, North America flips over and kind of crushes down into northern Europe, Antarctica kind of sandwiches up on the end, Australia comes and flips up and fits underneath India, and so on and so forth, right? So we see that in the world today. We can even match many fossil layers across the world, so it also indicates that they were laid down in a single event when the world was one landmass. And finally, you have an indication both in Genesis chapter 8, end of 7, chapter 8, as well as in Psalm 104. Psalm 104 starts with creation and moves to Noah's flood. And in verse 5 or 6-ish, it says, the mountains rose up, the valley sank down to the place where you, God, determined them to be, talking about the end of the flood. So you have an indication again of massive earth movement, of the land rising up, the valley sinking down, and indeed the continents breaking up and splitting apart. So I have no issue with the idea of Pangea, Gondwana, anything like that, right? These different supposed stages of Earth's development. The one thing I do have issue with is that it happened very slowly over millions of years. I think that the evidence it suggests, both from the science as well as from what we read in Scripture, there was one landmass which broke up towards the end of the flood as the land began to rise up out of the sea, producing what we see today. We'll finish it there. I will be around, come and chat, and we're going to come back in about 15 minutes for our next presentation. And if time allows, we'll have another, perhaps slightly longer Q&A session at the end of that next presentation. Thank you very much. We'll see you around. Together for our second session of the evening. All right, well, a reminder of our websites, creationresearchusa.org and creationresearch.net. Hopefully most of you were able to grab a magazine. We've got plenty more of them. We'll just pull some out in case you didn't get hold of one. And do remember to sign up as well for the newsletter. We have a USA local newsletter as well as a global newsletter that comes out, and you will be on the list for receiving when the magazines are available via subscription. So it's a good thing to stay up to date on all that we're doing. Our second session, the science of creation, the evidence of design. How do you recognize design? What's the history of creation been? And it's actually, this program has been around for quite a while. Both John and I worked on this presentation a number of years ago. And the segments in this have actually been used both in a debate that I did in the last couple of years against an atheist, as well as a program that I was asked to do last year for the first time, which was, Can a Scientist Believe in Creation? And so we're really going to delve down into what is a creation and how on earth could it possibly be scientific. And we're going to try and throw the odd biblical point in there as well. Who said this? Beware of false science, it leads you astray. The answer is the Apostle Paul to Timothy. He didn't say it in quite that way. That's our sort of paraphrase. This is the actual Bible verse in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 20. Timothy, keep that which is committed to your trust, avoiding profane and vain babblings and oppositions of science, falsely so called, which some professing have erred concerning the faith. It's, of course, the old King James, brilliant translation, and it does use that word science. In more modern translations, they use the term knowledge, because science and knowledge mean the same thing. They both mean knowledge. Science and knowledge, things that we know. Beware of false science, beware of false knowledge. The Apostle Paul is saying to Timothy, the point being, it will lead you astray. False science, false knowledge will lead you away from Christ. True knowledge will point you towards Christ. And it will affect the way that you view the world, and the history of the world will affect the way that you study the world and the way that you see the world today. One scientific paper published in Nature a number of years back, some 20 years back. Big journal, big famous journal. The world's first scientific classification is what the paper was called. And they had this to say about scientific classification. The earliest case of systematic naming occurred around 6,000 years ago when God brought all of his newly fashioned creatures to Adam to see what he would call them. Genesis chapter 2, verse 19. So it's very interesting that a secular, very secular publication actually allowed this even to be published. The first reference, the first case of classification happened when Adam named all the animals. Which is interesting because in the world that we live in today, they will tell you that science has got nothing to do with the Bible. They will say that scientific history has got nothing to do with the Bible, or indeed with creation. And then I will do something like present, as I did earlier, the concept of after their kind. The concept that we see in the world today that creatures don't evolve, they don't change, there are living fossils. And we make the point that 10 times in Genesis chapter 1, it says that God created all living things to reproduce after their kind. And the atheist will say, well, what on earth do you mean by a kind? In fact, I had it said to me in one debate that I was doing against a young atheist, and he said, there is no such scientific concept as a kind. And I said, I'm sorry, you need to go back and study your history a little bit. Because you see, if we ask the question, who invented the modern concept of genus and species, that's how we identify and categorize animals today. If we said to you, Canis lupus, we are, of course, talking about the dog. Specifically, we're talking about the grey wolf. And if we say Canis lupus variation familiaris, we are talking about the domestic dog. which means, of course, that the pug, with all of its degenerate mutations, is exactly the same species as the grey wolf, scientifically. Because the man who invented this modern concept, this binomial concept, two-naming concept of genus and species, was actually a creationist, a Bible believer, by the name of Carl von Linn, or Carl Linnaeus. What did he do? Well, he basically wrote his book about the system of nature. How do we categorize and catalogue and classify all living creatures? And he believed the Bible, and he would have read Genesis chapter 1, verse 11. How do I know? Well, we'll come on to that in a moment. Because you see, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 11, it says, God commanded the earth to bring forth plants, each after their own kind. The English word for kind is kind. That's why it's in our Bible. The Hebrew word for kind is min. And if you go into the Latin Vulgate, which is the Bible that Carl Linnaeus would have been reading back in the 1700s, prepared in 405 AD by Jerome, well, there it is in Latin. I won't read it in Latin, but have a look at that word highlighted in red. Can you see what it is? Genus. Hey, we've heard of that word before. It's in our modern-day classification system. In fact, if you go to the Septuagint, which is the Greek, it also has that word genus there as well. So in English, the word is kind. In Hebrew, the word is min. But in Greek and Latin, the word is genus. So the question is, of course, what is a kind? Well, the word itself comes from the Old English kin, which means related to each other, but not related to a non-kin or a separate group. So, for instance, mankind. All of man is related to each other, but we're not related to things which are not mankind, or kinsmen. We're heading rather rapidly towards Christmas, and the famous caroling songs which talk about to all your kin, it's the same word. Or indeed, Dawkins. It's the same root word there. You heard of the famous atheist Richard Dawkins? He hates this kind of research, but even his name gives validity to the creation point of view. You see, the biblical sense is that the bird kind was originally created completely separately and completely unrelated to the fish kind or any other kind. By the way, that's reiterated in the New Testament when the Apostle Paul says there is one kind of flesh of the birds, one of the fish, one of the animals, and one of man. Whereas evolution says birds are related to all things, and particularly to the reptiles from which they arose. Remember, birds were supposed to have evolved from dinosaurs. In fact, evolution says this: fish all by themselves turned into amphibians all by themselves, which all by themselves turned into reptiles, which all by themselves turned into mammals, which all by themselves turned into the original bear kind, which all by themselves diversified into different bears like the polar bears and the black bears and the brown bears and so on and so forth. Whereas the Bible says in the beginning God created bears, and there was the original bear kind. And we have observed and can still see today an enormous amount of variation within that kind, but they are all still bears. Indeed, in mankind, it says that God created one man, Adam. In fact, in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, from one blood, from one man, all people have come from. All the different human races, red, brown, yellow, black, and white, they have all descended from the one man, Adam. Therefore, we are the one kind. In fact, you can even see this concept in the bacteria. Again, a publication in the very famous journal Nature. An article called Filamentaceous Microfossils in a, what's that? 3,235 million year old volcagenetic massive sulfide deposit. 3,235 million, that's 3.2 billion, by the way. What did they find? They find filamentaceous bacteria. What does filamentaceous bacteria look like today? Well, there it is. 3.2 billion years and bacteria haven't evolved. They still look the same. So even the fossils, and we could talk for a long time about living fossils, but even the fossils point back to creation. In fact, the famous scientist Stephen Jay Gould said this: our ability to classify both living and fossil species distinctly and using the same criteria fits splendidly with creationist tenets. Well, that doesn't really surprise me, because I do believe that the Bible is true from the very beginning. It says that in Psalm 119, verse 160. And so it really shouldn't surprise us that the fossil, as well as the biological, fits very nicely with the Bible. You see, Carl Linnaeus, simply when he came to classify fossils, to invent this binomial system, he simply lifted a word straight out of the Bible. He said, well, God created according to their kind, therefore I should have a classification system which reflects this design. And so he created a classification based on the kind. The word kind in Latin is the word genus. So yes, kind is absolutely a scientific concept. It's enshrined in our modern scientific way of thinking. And he recognized, however, that there was an awful lot of diversity within that kind, a lot of special types within that kind. And so he invented a second classification, the word species, which still has no agreed upon scientific definition, because it's clear that there's enormous variation within a single kind, but the kinds themselves are still very distinctive. They were when God created them, they were in Carl Linnaeus' day, they were in Stephen Jay Gould's day, and they are indeed still today the same today. Our aim in creation research is to show that there are plenty of opinions, theories, ideas, and hypotheses that contradict with every single part of the Bible, but the facts never actually do. Well, let's talk a little bit more about this diversity versus evolution. What actually is evolution? One quote from a young atheist that I debated a couple of years back. In fact, you can actually go and watch this debate. It's out on YouTube. He said, what we're talking about when it comes to evolution is change in existing life forms. Well, that sounds like a very simple definition of what evolution is. Let's see if we can see some evidence of change, shall we? And see whether evidence of change really is evidence for evolution. You see, what Gray was doing is observing change. He called observable change evolution. He assumed that given enough time, small changes can develop into big changes, and therefore he calls evolution science. You see, Taylor Gray made exactly the same mistake that Charles Darwin did. He observed change on a small scale, assumed that over a large time scale, big changes would happen, and therefore claimed to have evidence of evolution. In fact, there's his book on the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. A fellow, by the way, as you can see down the bottom there, of the Royal Geological and Linnaean Societies. Linnaean Societies, Carl Linnaeus, who invented our classification system, which included a system based on the Bible. So Charles Darwin had absolutely no excuse. He knew very well what the biblical concept was of kinds. He knew very well what the Bible said, not just because he was a member of the Linnaean Society named after the author who actually based his ideas on the Bible, but also because, do you see that there? Charles Darwin, M.A., a master of what? Of science? No. Of medical? No. Of theology. And this was back in the day where if you wanted to get a master's of theologies, you actually had to read your Bible. And he would have indeed known what the scriptures said about creation. So what evidence is there for evolution? Well, we've got an experiment that has been going on in the world for about the past 5,000 years. That's the longest running experiment in the history of mankind. It's giving us some very interesting results. I am, of course, talking about agriculture, because we can do some experiments on all sorts of different plants. Agriculture that has been around for many, many, many years. And in particular, we're going to talk about the brassica kind. The brassica kind is a very diverse kind. Here are just 3 examples of brassica plants within the brassica kind. Brassica napus, which is your, we call it oil seed, you call it canola over here, like canola oil. We've got Brassica rapa, or the pak choi, and then we've got Brassica oleracea. Brassica oleracea is the wild cabbage. Now, Brassica oleracea is interesting because that is, of course, a genus and a species combined. Brassica is the kind, remember created kind. Oleracea is the species. But just Brassica oleracea itself is incredibly diverse, because from the single Brassica oleracea, you can produce broccoli. If you breed it to have a big flower head. If you breed it to have a really big flower head, it's called calabrese, which is often called broccoli in your supermarkets. If you then mutate the flower head so that you lose all of its color, we call it cauliflower. Or you can breed it to become diverse into what we call collard greens. Or you can cut the top off of the cabbage greens and allow little cabbages to sprout out of the sides, and we call them sprouts. Or you can mutate them into all sorts of pretty colors, and we grow them in our gardens in lieu of flowers. Or you can turn it into cabbages and kale and kohlrabi. All of these different vegetables are not only the same kind, they're the same species. All of that diversity in a single species. Are they all still cabbages? Yes, they are. Which means that there has absolutely been an enormous amount of change. I mean, a kohlrabi looks nothing like a cauliflower. A piece of kale looks nothing like a broccoli. And yet scientifically, they are all considered the same species. Not even just the same kind, the same species. Change? Absolutely. Evolution? No, not one whatsoever. In fact, we found a very interesting location in the UK where they'd been growing cabbages up the top, and the seed had grown down onto the side of the hill, and over successive generations, they had reverted from the modern cultivated cabbage back into Brassica oleracea. That's the way that the natural world goes. It's our mankind using our dominion to breed these different variations, diversifications, but left alone, they go back to Brassica oleracea. So what do we actually observe? Well, what we observe in all living things, not just cabbages, but dogs and cats and everything, is diversification within a very clear boundary. Diversification within a kind. All of it, by the way, as the result of a loss of information, a removal and a switching off of certain features, which is not evolution at all. The National Academy of Sciences, while attacking creationists, said this: in science, everything we observe, measure, and discover must be successfully tested again and again before it is accepted as valid and factual evidence of what is real. They said that in a response, in an attack on creationists. Let's take that and let's flip it right back at them. Because you see, on this chart, we have the evolution of dogs. Fish all by themselves turned into amphibians, all by themselves turned into reptiles, all by themselves turned into mammals, which all by themselves turned into the original dog kind. And that original dog kind turned into every single different type of wild and domestic dog we see today. Whether that be a fox, or a poodle, or a wolf, or a dingo. Well, we have two different things going on here. Two different halves of the slide. One of these is observed, one of these is not. We've observed dogs diversifying. We have several thousand years worth of history, observable history, showing us how we diversify dogs. Because we wanted to breed a big, horrible dog in order to help us hunt lions, and so we bred the poodle. It's remarkable when you see the little tiny fluffy poodle today. The original poodles were designed to hunt lions. And yet, one of those is observed, but the fish turning into dogs has never been observed. You see, the origin of dogs, according to the Bible, is that in the beginning, God created dogs. And yes, he created them with an amazing ability, amazing genetic ability to be able to diversify in all the different dog kinds that dog types rather, that we see today in terms of breeds, but they're all still dogs. In fact, we even see that reflected in our modern classification system. As I mentioned earlier, Canis lupus is the grey wolf, but Canis lupus familiaris, By the way, variation familiaris is the old scientific concept of race, the lowest common denominator in the classification system. They're still the same species, they're still the same kind, which means that a pug is the same species as a grey wolf. That's a lot of diversification. Whereas evolution says this happens slowly over millions of years all by itself. Well, what do we actually observe then? Well, we certainly don't see any evolution happening today. There's been no evolution observed in the last 4,000 to 5,000 years worth of agriculture, and there's been no evolution over hundreds of thousands of observed generations of plants and animals. Which is the reason why, by the way, that Richard Dawkins, the famed atheist, said this: evolution has been observed, he said. It's just that it hasn't been observed while it's happening. What he's just told you there is that it hasn't been observed. In fact, the argument for the ultimate evidence of evolution is supposed to come from the fossil record. Because it's all great if you want to try and find evidence for evolution today. There hasn't been any evidence of evolution today. But if you do happen to find some evidence for evolution today, that's still not going to prove that that's how it happened in the past. If you want to prove that that's how it's happened in the past, you want to find a record of past history in which we should be able to see evidence of evolution. The fossil record is what that would be if you were to look at it. What do you find in the fossil record? Well, we've already made this point tonight. You find living fossils, creatures that have not evolved. In fact, we've brought a whole bunch of living fossils here with us tonight, from starfish to crabs to shells and much, much more. Well, living fossil sounds like an oxymoron. Why, how could you have a living fossil? Well, it was a term that was coined by Charles Darwin. He said these anomalous forms may be called living fossils. They've endured to the present day. He said that they should be anomalies. Why? Because his book, The Origin of Species, was all about change, all about creatures changing, all about creatures evolving. And he said there's a problem. In fact, he said there's lots of problems. Number one, there's no evidence for it. He literally had a whole chapter about problems with his theory. But he also said one of the other problems is that we don't see it in the fossil record. Species and groups of species, he said, which are called abherent, they may be fancifully called the living fossils, will aid us in forming a picture of the ancient forms of life. There was a little contradiction, because in one word he said these anomalous forms may be called the living fossils. They've endured to the present day. In other words, they've remained unchanged. But he then later said it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the one that's most intelligent. It's the one that's most adaptable to change. In other words, his whole theory is about change, and yet we don't see that change in the fossil record. There is some kind of change we see in the fossil record. Let me give you an example of the kind of change we see in the fossil record, because it still doesn't help Darwin's theory. Come to Yorkshire in the United Kingdom, to the Jurassic Rocks. Jurassic Rocks, of course, named after the Jura Mountains in Germany, nothing to do with millions of years or evolution. But in the Jurassic Rocks of Yorkshire, you find fossils. In particular, you find fossils like this. This is a fossil ginkgo. Beautiful fossils. Can you see all the fronds on the leaves? The many different lobes that have come out? Well, you see, we still have ginkgos alive today. There they are. In fact, this was growing outside my university. Do you notice a bit of difference between the leaves? That's how ginkgos used to look. That's how they look today. In fact, the species name for ginkgo today, they're both called ginkgo, so they're both the same kind. Even scientifically, they're both the same kind. But ginkgos today have the scientific name Ginkgo biloba. Bi-2-loba, like the lobes on your ears. The ginkgo today only has 2 lobes. In fact, you can see the lobes starting to appear on a couple of these examples on the trees. They have like a split running down the middle. So today they only have 2 lobes. In the past, in the fossil record, they had lots and lots of lobes. Now, is that change? Absolutely. In the past, they used to have lots of lobes. Today, they don't. Is it evolution, though? Well, we've actually been able to identify within the modern-day ginkgo a specific gene. A gene that is broken, and a gene that produces, you guessed it, shorter lobes. In fact, we can actually see this happening over time. Ginkgos used to have big, long lobes. We find that in the fossil record. Today, they only have 2. And we've identified the gene that has caused this to happen. The gene is broken. It's undergone a mutation. So is it change? Absolutely. Is it evolution? Not in the slightest. The ginkgo has lost the ability to produce these lobes. It's not evolving onwards and upwards and better. It's getting more and more unhealthy, more and more mutated, more and more broken. Again, we've already quoted from Stephen Jay Gould. He was known as the sort of the honest paleontologist because he actually recognized, even though he remained an evolutionist, he recognized many of the serious problems with evolution. He said, all paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Transitions between major groups are characteristically abrupt. There is no evidence in the fossil record for evolution. In fact, the National Geographic a few years back in 2004 put out a great big cover page article saying, was Darwin wrong? And you turned the pages to get to the main article and had a great big no. We've found abundant evidence for evolution, they said. And they went on to list some of the so-called evolution. But hidden in the middle of all this evidence for evolution, this is what they said. Illuminating but spotty, the fossil record is like a film of evolution from which 999 out of every 1,000 frames have been lost. Okay, question. If you watched a film in which 99.9% of the film didn't exist, do you think you'd get to the solution of the plot? Do you think you'd even work out what the plot was? So if that's the case, how on earth could there be any evidence for evolution? Well, there simply is not. You see, the evidence that we do find from fossils is that creatures have either remained exactly the same and there's been no change. You can see that down here with the crabs, with the starfish, with the shells. If there is any change, like the ginkgos, it's always devolution. It's the opposite of evolution. It's a loss of information. Or you can find that creatures have gone extinct, like, as far as we can tell, the dinosaurs have. None of these are any help to evolution in the slightest. Because if you've remained exactly the same, and some of the oldest living fossils are over 3 billion years old, supposedly, but if you've existed for 3 billion years and you haven't changed, you're not likely to change anytime soon. You're stuck in a rut. If you have changed, but you're not evolving, you're devolving, you're not evolving, you're going the wrong way. And if you're extinct, you couldn't evolve even if you wanted to, because of course you're now dead. You see, none of these three things is any help to evolution in the slightest, but it's exactly what we would expect to see if the Bible was true. If the Bible was true, if creation really did happen, if God really did create according to his kinds, if the world really was judged at the fall and at the global flood, this evidence is exactly what we would expect to find if the Bible was true. But why, therefore, then, do we bring Charles Darwin into everything, particularly in science? Well, Philip Skell had this interesting discussion in another article in a magazine called The Scientist. He said, evolutionary theory contributes little to experimental biology. In other words, when you're doing experimental biology, by experimental biology, he's talking about going into the lab and actually testing things. Evolution doesn't come into it. It doesn't need to come into it. Despite the fact that when you pick up a journal paper and read about that research, evolution will always come into it, even though it had very little bearing on what they were doing in the first place. In fact, he then went on to say, I have asked more than 70 eminent researchers if they would have done their work differently had they thought that Darwin's theory was wrong. The responses were all the same, no. In other words, evolution has very little bearing on what we have done in science over the past 150 odd years, except for one. I would argue that it has had a massive and negative impact on our way that we study and the way that we develop science, because it has limited, because it has taught us that living creatures are simply the product of random chance. And so do you know what? For many, many years, the appendix was believed to be a vestigial organ, to have no use. Nobody stopped to think, well, hang on a minute, maybe God created it and it does have a use. You know what we found? It does have a use. In fact, every single vestigial organ which was written off as simply an evolutionary leftover has all been found to have a use in recent years. Evolution simply inhibits the way that you do science. Perhaps this can be seen most abundantly in the testimony of Richard Dawkins himself. Richard Dawkins now calls himself a cultural Christian. Years he spent attacking God. Years he spent attacking Christians and Christianity. He now calls himself a cultural Christian. Do you know why I think he calls himself a cultural Christian? Because Richard Dawkins has recently been cancelled in the UK. He had a book publisher pull out of a recent book deal. He had a number of lectures and discussions and visitations cancelled. Do you know why? Because he said the only scientific definition of gender is male and female. And he got cancelled for that. Do you know why I think he calls himself a cultural Christian? Because he has seen where his atheistic beliefs lead to. He has seen the lunacy that a purely atheistic, a purely non-religious, a purely non-moral point of view, he's seen the lunacy that it gives birth to. Richard Dawkins is a very intelligent man. He's a very sane man. He's a very logical man. He's spent all his life attacking Christianity and attacking God, and he's now come to realize where that new atheism belief leads to, and he doesn't like it. So he wants the benefits of Christianity, the moral implication, the logical implication, the implication that led scientists to do research all those years. He wants the benefits of Christianity without the consequences of it. The consequences of it is you're a sinner in need of a savior, and you need to repent and come towards a holy God. He doesn't like that part, even though he's on record of saying, I now believe I've been attacking the wrong God all my life, in reference to Islam. I think he's probably right. But he now calls himself a cultural Christian because I believe he has come to realize exactly where his atheistic views lead to. They lead to lunacy. They lead to no logical conclusion whatsoever. I do believe that evolutionary theory has hindered the scientific progression over the last several years. Well, as we begin to wrap things up, let's ask ourselves this question. How would you be able to recognize a design? How would you be able to recognize that God really did create things? And we're going to start with a rather simple question. What is a guitar? Well, a guitar is a 100% musical object made from 100% non-musical wood. I mean, what's a guitar made from? It's made from wood, and you've got some strings, traditionally made from entwined horsehair. Well, you can walk up to a tree and you can strum it, you're not going to get a sound. You can strum a horse and you might get a sound, but it's not going to sound like a guitar. But if you take those individual materials and you apply a little bit of time, but most importantly, you apply intelligence, you can manipulate that wood and that horsehair into an instrument that works, into an instrument that does make sound. In fact, if you apply more intelligence, you can produce a beautiful song. And I'm sure that John has used this argument with you before. What is a boomerang? A boomerang is a 100% returning object made from 100% non-returning wood. You throw trees and they don't come back. But if you take that tree and you manipulate it into an aeroplane wing with an airfoil on one end, then you throw it, it does indeed come back. In fact, Dr. Chris DeCarlos, while debating John Mackay, said a creation is something that cannot happen by itself. Now, I don't quite know why he said that while debating John Mackay, because that happens to be an absolutely brilliant definition of what a creation is. Creation, by definition, means that there was a creator. And in fact, if you carry this sort of logic through a boomerang, the end product, the boomerang, has got properties that does not come from the stuff that it's made of. Trees do not come back by themselves. The end product, the boomerang, has got a property, it does come back when you throw it, that does not inherently come from the tree. And indeed, the same is with a guitar. A guitar has got properties, it's a musical instrument that does not inherently come from the tree or the horse. And both a boomerang and a guitar prove that somebody who existed before the boomerang, somebody who is not part of the boomerang, and somebody who is far smarter than the boomerang has made the wood do what wood does not do by itself. So a creation is something that cannot happen by itself. The end product has got properties that do not come from the stuff that it is made of. And a creation will always prove that somebody who is not part of it, somebody who existed before it, and somebody who is far smarter than it actually made it do what it doesn't do by itself. Now, you can use this logic and apply it to any kind of design thing. You can say, what is a car? Well, a car is a 100% moving object made from 100% non-moving parts. The car by itself does not assemble itself. In fact, the sand that is used to make the glass doesn't put itself into window panes. The trees don't form rubber tires by themselves. The iron from the ground doesn't come together to form the body. But if you take intelligence and you apply that intelligence to the world around you, you can make those products do, or you can make those items, those original parts do what they do not do by themselves. It's the same with a jumbo jet. A jumbo jet is a 100% flying object made from 100% non-flying parts. And pretty much nearly every time I take off in one, I do wonder whether the thing is actually going to fly. And you have to put a lot of trust, a lot of faith in the person who actually did all the nuts and bolts up. But it does come from materials that do not inherently contain a flying machine. And yet put together in the right order, applied with the right intelligence, you get a jumbo jet. We can go one step further. What's a computer code? Well, a computer code is a 100% meaningful result made from a 100% meaning-free source. In a computer, there's just ones and zeros. But that 1 doesn't mean 1 and the 0 doesn't mean 0. Those are simply the symbols which have been chosen to produce the code. Which means when I go click, the next page comes up. 1 doesn't mean 1, 0 doesn't mean 0, and in fact you can go even further because by themselves they do not come together to produce any kind of code outside of an intelligent designer. In fact, if we just pause on codes for a second, if I was to come and say to you ... what am I saying? I'm saying SOS. And I'm using a code. That code is Morse code. But you see, I'm speaking to you, I'm making noise with my mouth that says ... dot. But dots and dashes don't mean anything unless an inventor says they do. That's why we call it Morse code, because it was Samuel Morse who invented it. Now, could I say to you ... with a whistle? It would work. I could do 3 short peeps, 3 large peeps, 3 short peeps. It would work. Could I say SOS in Morse code to you using a flashlight? Yes, I could. Could I say it using sticks and stones? I could do, sticks, stones. It would work, wouldn't it? But you see, none of those things, the noise that comes from the whistle, the light that comes from the flashlight, and the sticks and stones lying on the ground outside, none of those things inherently contain the code SOS. It takes an intelligent designer not just to invent the code, but an intelligent designer to actually make those natural items say what the inventor and the designer of the code actually wants them to say. A code, by definition, is a design. It's a creation, and a creation is something that cannot happen by itself. The end product, the computer code, the SOS, has got properties. It conveys information to you that does not come from the materials that it's made of, the light or the sound or the rocks. Therefore, you pay the creator his due. That's why we call it Morse code. That's why you go driving around with the badge Ford on the front, because we pay the creator their due. So let's go one final step. What is DNA? Well, it's the code for life. DNA is a 100% coded substance made from 100% non-coding parts. Sugars, phosphates, most of which you probably ate for your breakfast this morning. By themselves, they do not code for life. But put them together in the right way, and you have the most complex information holding system that we know in the known universe, which is not just there to code for life. It codes in 4 dimensions because it's a linear code. It codes linear, it codes in 2 dimensions, up and down and side by side. It's a 3D structure, and the 4th dimension is time, because over time the DNA will fold in a particular way in order to code for something different. It's a 4-dimensional coding system with an inbuilt copy designed to make an inbuilt mechanism designed to make copies of itself. And I hope you realize that you are designed to not evolve. Because within DNA, there is a mechanism designed to stop you from mutating. And mutations are supposed to be the driving force of evolution. So how on earth did DNA invent all by itself a code to stop it from mutating if that's the driving force of evolution? Should be the opposite. The fact that you have that mechanism tells you that you were designed to reproduce after your own kind. You see, the original DNA, the perfect created DNA, we live in a fallen world, we have broken DNA now. But the original DNA shows all the evidence of a pre-existent and intelligent creator. Somebody who was not part of the DNA, somebody who existed before the DNA, and somebody who was far smarter than the DNA actually made those original components do what they do not do by themselves. Therefore, you pay the creator his due. Who is this creator? Well, let's go one final step. You see, if you want to try and create life, you really don't try natural processes. Natural processes destroy information. Right? Matter plus energy plus time equals life, according to the theory of evolution. All you need is matter, energy, and given enough time and enough lightning strikes, you'll eventually produce life. So don't try natural processes, it won't work. Try creative processes. You want to add information. You see, if you add information, if you have matter plus energy plus time, plus you add information, outside information, added by you if you're clever enough. To this day, we haven't been clever enough to produce life. But if you have matter and energy and a bit of time, plus you add in outside information, then you might find life. But the problem is that no matter found in the universe shows any natural properties that could generate life by itself. So the question we then have to ask is, what on earth happened in the beginning in order to make life happen? And we have to think about it. Outside intelligence is required from a pre-existing intelligent design in order to produce life. So you could sum this up scientifically by saying, in the beginning, information was given. That's a logical scientific statement. In the beginning, information was given. So, could in the beginning information was given be said another way? Well, I mean, if you want to put this together, the formula is matter plus energy plus time plus outside information equals life. And this could be said using a much, much, much older statement. In the beginning was the Word. John chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word. What's the Word? It's a type of information, isn't it? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. So the Word is equal to God. The Word indeed was God. So the Word is eternal, the Word is equal to God, and the Word is God. The same was in the beginning with God, and all things were made by the Word. Now that's a pretty powerful word. That's a more powerful word than my word. It's a more powerful word than anybody's word. All things were made by the Word, and without the Word was not anything made that was made. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So therefore, why is this so important? Well, we can get to the answer of why this creation stuff is so important, because it's common in churches today to say, only worry about the New Testament. Only worry about Jesus Christ, his death and burial and resurrection. It doesn't really matter about origins. Well, I'm sorry, but it really does. You see, if you want to get to the bottom of it, you have to ask, well, what is Christianity? Well, Christianity, according to the Oxford Dictionary, is a religion based on the life and death of Jesus Christ. Life and death is quite interesting, but the reality is, this is what the Apostle Paul makes the point of, Christianity is a fact-based faith. Without facts, our faith is dead. He says in 1 Corinthians 15, if Christ is not risen, your faith is futile. You're still in your sins. Then those who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. If in this life only we have hope in Christ, we are of all men the most pitiable. You see, Paul makes the very important point. If Jesus Christ didn't really come, if Jesus Christ didn't really die, if Jesus Christ didn't really rise again, we might as well give up now. Our faith is dead. You see, Christianity is a faith for sure, but it is a faith that is dependent upon facts. Jesus Christ really needed to come, really needed to die, and really needed to rise again in order for our faith to be worth anything whatsoever. And by the way, Romans says, for just as through one man sin entered the world and death through sin, thus death spread to all men. For if by the one man's offense judgment came to all men resulting in condemnation, even so through one man's righteous act the free gift came to all men resulting in the justification of life. Paul's legal logic is very tight. He says one sinful man's life brought death, therefore it takes one sinless man's death to bring life. You see, not only is our faith dependent on facts, the facts being the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the whole need for the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ is based on Genesis, the one man Adam who sinned. That's why we needed one sinless man to die for us. You see, at the top of the pillar is Christianity, the whole encompassing belief. Christianity itself is based on the cross and the resurrection. Our facts must be real, must be true in order for our faith to have any substance whatsoever. Jesus Christ really needed to die and rise again. But the cross and the resurrection are built on the origin of death. Why? Because without an origin of death, there was no need for Jesus Christ to die in order to take the penalty of our sin, which the penalty of our sin is death. That's why Jesus had to die. And the reason why death is a bad thing is because it's a penalty for sin, because there was no death in the beginning. It was a very good world. And the origin of death is found in the book of Genesis. Proverbs chapter 30 says, every word of God is pure. He is a shield to those who trust in him. Do not add to his words, lest he rebuke you and you be found a liar. You see, you have to be very, very careful if you want to try and add other things like evolution and millions of years into the Bible, because, well, you really truly are adding to God's word. You see, you can't have the last Adam without the first Adam. It was the first Adam that brought sin and death into the world. It's the last Adam that paid the penalty so that we could be free for it. So why focus on the evidence for a young earth and Noah's flood? Well, Luke chapter 16. If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded though one rise from the dead. Oh, you remember the context of this? It's the account of the rich man and the poor man Lazarus. Right? The rich man dies, the poor man Lazarus dies, and what happens? The rich man goes into torment. The poor man Lazarus goes into paradise. And Abraham's there. And the rich man begs Abraham, let me go back to my family, because if they see somebody rise from the dead, then they'll believe. What had Abraham said as Jesus was recounting this? He said, if they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded though one rise from the dead. You've already got the scriptures. You've already got Moses. You've already got the prophets. You've already got Genesis. If you don't believe that, you won't be persuaded even if somebody rose from the dead. You know what we can do, though? Flip that on its head. If people do hear, if people do listen, if people can accept, if people truly believe Moses and the prophets, that they were real history, that it was based on real historical events, that the faith that we have as Christians is a real fact-based faith, then maybe they can be persuaded that one really did rise from the dead. That one being Jesus Christ. Our motto in creation research is Isaiah chapter 41 verse 20. We want people to see and know. We want people to consider and understand together that the Lord has done this. The Holy One of Israel has created it. If we can show people that they can trust the Bible, that God's word really is true from the very beginning, then they can be persuaded that one really did die, one really did rise from the grave, and that, as the Lord said himself, come now, let us reason together. Your sins are like scarlet, but they can be as white as snow. Though they be red like crimson, they shall be as white as wool. That's why we deal with creation, because it's all about pointing people back to the one who did the creating, Jesus Christ. Well, a reminder, we've got a field trip coming up on Friday. Speak to Cheryl if you want to find out more. Come and see the evidence for creation in the living fossils down the front here, as well as a whole bunch of resources. If you like the sciencey stuff, grab that research paper on dinosaur soft tissue. It is quite heavy going, it is quite sciencey, but it does show you that creationists can indeed do real science, and the real science does point you back to the Bible. And if you want something a little bit more readable, Creation Research Magazine, brand new publication, available for free here tonight if you would like to pick up one of those. Thank you very much for having me again. It's been an absolute pleasure, as it always is. God bless, and I look forward to seeing you around. Have we got a little bit of time for questions? 5-10 minutes? All right, thank you. Let's take some questions then, if we've got some questions. And if not, we'll come and engage and spend some time together down here. Let me just grab your microphone for the recording as well.
Richard Dawkins, I believe,
Yeah.
later in his life, not
Yeah.
long before his death, he wrote a book called The Grand Design. And in that book, he stated, out of necessity, the universe had to create something out of nothing. Do you hear any response from the scientific community on how this creation could have possibly happened?
Yeah. So continue to pray for Richard Dawkins. He's still alive.
I thought he died.
No, he's still alive. Sorry, did you say, who did you say?
No, I said Hawking.
Hawking, Stephen Hawking.
I meant
Sorry,
Stephen
yes.
Hawking.
Stephen Hawkins is dead. He's now a creationist.
Yeah.
It's probably a bit of a dark joke there. Yeah, no, you are right. He said, well, it's interesting. Stephen Hawkins and Richard Dawkins actually worked together quite closely because it's interesting seeing the contradictions that they had together. Yes, you are right. He did say that the universe must have come out of nothing. That's a necessity. Well, it certainly is a necessity if you want to believe in atheism. Richard Dawkins has gone on to say as well that given enough time, the universe can create things to have the appearance of being designed. Now, both of those statements from both of those men are based on this, number one, pre-existent belief in atheism, but also both of those statements are necessary in order to promote and believe in atheism. If you believe in atheism, if you believe in no God, the universe must have. Now, that's not a scientific requirement. That's a requirement if you're an atheist. Now, you cannot prove an atheism scientifically. There is no way of objectively proving that there is no God. So immediately, if you claim to be an atheist, you immediately, at the very least, have got a faith. Right? You are effectively a religion. Now, an agnostic is a little bit better. An agnostic says we can't know whether there's a God. Well, that's a little bit better than an atheist. You could argue it's a less faith position, but what it is a position of ignorance, right? Because the evidence for a God is so overwhelmingly abundant, not just in creation, not just in science, but that's what it says in Romans chapter 1. He has stamped his nature onto all creation, so mankind has got no excuse. So what you're dealing with is not a scientific question, it is or a scientific statement, it is a statement that is necessary for an evolutionist. Therefore, it is a foolish statement. Because to try and claim that the universe could come together, as we've talked tonight, you can do the same tests about evidence of design on everything, including things like stars, right? We have never seen a star being born. We assume that stars must be born in order for the universe to be billions of years old. But we've never seen it. In fact, there's lots in science that say you cannot produce that. Why? Because you can never get enough pressure to compress gas to enough of a ball in order to kickstart nuclear fusion. We still don't even know how nuclear fusion really works. Closest we can get is fission, which is nuclear energy, but fusion is a phenomenal, if we could harness fusion, it would be fantastic. You could take a bit of matter the size of a tree and run a country for years, right, with fusion. And we've never seen that happen naturally from a non-fusion perspective. What we've always seen is that stars are always running. So stars, by definition, using this same logic we've talked about tonight, have got properties that do not come from the materials they're made from. So stars are a design. Stars are created. But if you're an atheist like Hawkins was, then you have to believe that the universe can do the impossible in order to be able to be an atheist. Much like Richard Dawkins says that he is willing to believe that given enough time, the universe will have the appearance of being designed, even though it wasn't. Now, that is a nonsense statement. It is a foolish statement. And I have to say, people like Hawkins, people like Dawkins, they are highly intelligent fools. And I use that word deliberately because that's what the scriptures say. A
How do they
fool
deal
says
with
there's
like
no God.
Francis Crick? And
Yeah.
he was a Nobel Prize winner.
Yeah.
And the discoveries he made about DNA, that it was a helix, and yet he said that we now know, because of DNA and the research, that evolution was an impossibility. So how do they deal with his scientific conclusion?
Mostly ignore it.
Yeah.
No scientist comes from a completely biased background. Let's rephrase that. No scientist comes from a completely non-biased background. Every scientist has got a bias. Every scientist has got an underlying belief system which affects the way that they do science and affects the way that they study it. Now, Crick had got to the point where he was a world-famous Nobel Prize winner, way up there, right? Very, very rich as well. He wasn't going to be bothered by saying statements like that, right? For most scientists, that's a question of their career. right? You come out with statements like that, you're certainly not going to get any funding, right? So you don't come out with statements like that. And so there's always a bias, and there's always something, usually an institutional philosophy, which is binding you to do your work in a certain way. Now, by and large, that sort of unaffects science in the sense that, most science doesn't have anything to do with evolution, but it does have stuff to do with philosophies, like, for instance, the philosophy of climate change and so on and so forth. We're now getting papers that are being published supporting trans ideology, despite the fact that it's complete nonsense scientifically. Well, it's because you're being walled into a certain way of actually thinking. So once you get to the position that some of these professors do, where they're basically retired and at the top, you can say things like that. It doesn't affect you, but it will affect you if you're. That's why most scientists don't do it.
He did go to his death believing alien beings had put life on Earth. He said
Exactly.
that's the only
Yes,
conclusion,
that's the-
and he
exactly,
was that
yeah.
close to it. He was right.
Yeah,
It
he
wasn't-
came to the conclusion that intelligent design must be the answer. The problem with the intelligent design belief system is that it attempts to address the question of design but completely fails to attribute designer. The problem with that is that Richard Dawkins is on record saying that intelligent design is a possibility. Now, he's an atheist. How on earth can he believe that? He believes that it's a possibility provided it's aliens from outer space. Now, you haven't concluded who the designer is because all you've done is shove the question into outer space and then just leave it at that, right? That's the problem with the intelligent design movement. They are happy to deal with the so-called scientific arguments for design, but they fall short of actually describing who the designer is. Right? That's what distinguishes me from the intelligent design theorists. I make no qualms about it. I know personally the one who did the designing, right? And I can tell you about him. And so that's why with creation reason, it has to come back to the gospel. It has to come back to who Jesus Christ is. That's the failure of the intelligent design.
One last question. Unless somebody else has something. One last one. I don't understand the evolutionists and their association with Darwin, because Darwin clearly was not an evolutionist. He, in an article 20 years after the publication of The Origin of Species, he said, "I've never been an atheist," yet his face is the face of atheism. If you read an unabridged copy of his book, Origin of the Species, he makes about 5 or 6 direct references to the Creator. I mean, I've got an unabridged copy. And he was what he called a naturalist, and he believed God created life, but he created a limited number of life forms, and everything evolved from those limited number. So when you're debating or talking to atheists who claim to be Darwinists, yet they don't believe everything started with God, how did that disconnect happen? Because that's not Darwinism.
Yeah, just very briefly with Darwin. What you can see with Darwin is you can see a progression of his life. He started out as a theological training, right? He started out as a professing Christian believer, but then that's not necessarily saying much because that was 99% of the population of Britain at the time were professing Christians. Whether or not they were living Christians, whether or not they were born again Christians is another question. This is the height of Victorian England, the height of Christian England, and the height of Christian hypocrisy. Right? Queen Victoria is on record saying, well, of course, we know that only the poor sin. And that tells you you've got the wrong idea of how to behave to the poor and also the wrong idea of what Christianity is, okay? So it's a very hypocritical system. So that's the first point. The second point is Darwin himself progressed. Now, it's true, he did say that he was never an atheist, right? He believed in some God, and he believed at one point in his life that maybe God could have created things and then left things to go on their own, right? A sort of an early form of theistic evolution, if you like. That is being said, by the time you came to about 5 years before his death, in a letter that got published after his death, he wrote, "I have now come to see that the Holy Scriptures, with their manifestly false view of the history of the world and the absurd claims of Christ, can no longer be trusted any more than the sacred writings of the Hindus." In other words, just before his death, he now attributed the Holy Scriptures to being no more reliable than the pagan writings of the Hindus, right? And he also commented things like the manifestly false history of the world and the absurd claims of Christ, right? Now, that to me tells you that by this point he had rejected any validity of the Scriptures, and while he never expressly said there is no God, he certainly was getting close to that belief system, certainly in practice, okay? And there's no evidence, by the way, it's a common myth that he recanted on his deathbed. There's no evidence of that. The only story of that came about 20 years after his death by a lady who'd never met him, right? So we can't really rely on that. So be careful. Regardless of that, you are right. He has become the picture boy of atheism, the poster boy of atheism. And to be fair, his first belief systems, his Darwinian belief systems, is what gave atheism an excuse. Because if you can have evolution happening over millions of years, if life can arise from non-life and evolve by itself, you have no need for a God. Therefore, you can choose to reject the God by believing in this system. So regardless of whether he was or wasn't an atheist, and I suspect towards the end of life he was, based on his writings, it is what has given people the excuse to reject God. And so that's why we deal a lot with Darwin, because, as you rightly say, he comes up a lot. We've probably got time for a couple of more quick questions. Any other questions from the group? Oh, we've satisfied everybody. Well, I'll be around for a little bit, so do come and grab me and chat with me afterwards if you would like to. And thank you very much once again. It's always a pleasure to be here. And God bless. We'll see you around.